Hi there, this is just a quick video to give you some ideas how to answer the question 3D question for the Weimar and Nazi Germany history exam. Um, Now, as you can see from this overall slide, this is a 16-mark question, so it's the big one for the Germany exam. Plus, it's got 4 spelling marks as well, so 20 marks in total. So it is a big and important question for this exam. You'll also be able to see, hopefully, that this is another interpretations question. So it uses those same interpretations that you'd have looked at for question 3B and 3C. And again, it's important we're focusing on those interpretations rather than the sources, because it's very important we're looking at the correct things for this question. Okay, so these question 3Ds, as I said, they're worth 16 marks. You've got those spelling marks as well. And in some ways, there are similarities with other 16-mark questions that you would have looked at for your GCSE, but there are also some key differences too. Okay, so let's have a look at what they ask you to do. So it says, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about? That could be interpretation 1 or 2. It does vary year to year, depending on the question, depending on the paper. So you're asked how far you agree with one of the interpretations about whatever that topic has been that you've been looking at. Remember, for question 3, question 3A, B, C, and D are all on the same aspect of the course. So in that example you had in your formative assessment book, they're all for they're all about Nazi ideas towards women and their policies towards women. So in that case, this would be how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about Nazi policies towards women. It says to explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge of the historical context. That's not to be ignored, because it clearly points out you've got to use both interpretations. So whilst interpretation 2 might be in the question, you must include interpretation 1 as well. Really, really important. If you don't, your marks are severely limited. And also, something else you must use is your own knowledge of the historical context. You've got to bring in things you know over and above the things mentioned in those interpretations. And again, if you don't, it's going to seriously limit your marks. So making sure you include both interpretations in your knowledge is really key. So with this being a how far do you agree question, as you've done with, so for example, your medicine and Richard and John course, when you have a how far do you agree question, you're going to obviously have to come to a judgment and say how far you agree, to what extent, to a large extent, to a small extent, I largely agree, or I largely disagree. But you're always going to have to show both sides of this argument. You're going to have ways you agree, ways you disagree, and have that introduction, conclusion. And that's a similar structure for this one as well. So you'll start off, it's not marked on the screen here, but you start off with an introduction. You always have an introduction for these 16-mark questions. I think the very first thing you need to do here, a really useful thing for you and for the examiner, is to actually make it clear what the view is in interpretation 2. If you're asked how far do you agree with interpretation 2, what is it you're agreeing with or disagreeing with? What is the view in interpretation 2? That should be nice and straightforward, because you'd have written that down for question 3B. But it's worth pointing out the same examiner doesn't mark your 3B, your 3C, and your 3D. They won't know what you've written in previous questions. So you have to make that clear again for this question. So in that introduction, say, I largely agree, or I strongly agree, or I largely disagree, whatever you think, with the view in interpretation 2, that, and then tell me what the view is. So you know, and the examiner knows what is it you're actually agreeing with or disagreeing with. You actually know what the view is. Make sure that's really clear in that introduction, because then you can link everything to that. Once you've done your introduction, I would start off with ways you agree. I'd start off agreeing with the interpretation mentioned in the question. You can see here I put interpretation X, because that varies. The one in the question could be interpretation 1, it could be interpretation 2. Whichever one is in the question, start off in ways that you could agree with that interpretation. In some ways you could agree with the view interpretation 2 that Nazi policies were successful towards women, for example. And then use what it says in the interpretation. Look at what the details it gives, the examples that are in there. Use quotes from that interpretation. Back up what you're saying. So I agree with the view in the interpretation that, and put a quote in that it says. And then use your own knowledge to develop that. You've got to show the ways you can agree with that view. How can you agree that in this situation, this example from the formative assessment booklet, that Nazi policies towards women were successful? Show the ways you agree, using the facts in the interpretation, and also backing that up with your own knowledge. Support what it says with things and do try and connect that to what's in the interpretation. It's tempting, and quite often students simply say, I agree very strongly with the views interpretation 2, and then off they go talking about all the things that they know about that topic and why they think that's excellent and true, and all the things that they know, but without really linking it back to the interpretation. Try and look at the specifics. What examples are mentioned in the interpretation? What things does it hint at? What can you link your knowledge to? Try and connect those two things together. You've got to make sure you use both your knowledge and the interpretation as well. And that's the real difference between this question and, for example, the one in medicine or in Richard and John. Okay, once you've done the agreeing side, the next bit is the other side, the disagreeing side. Remember, what you're not doing is saying, I agree with interpretation 2, but actually, no, I agree with interpretation 1. You're evaluating interpretation 2. So you've said, in some ways, I agree with the views in interpretation 2. This next section is ways you disagree with interpretation 2. So you can say, on the other hand, I could also disagree with, or some might disagree with the views in interpretation 2. And then you're going to show the ways in which some of the views in interpretation 2 or 1, whichever one was in the question, might be wrong, might be inaccurate, or you could challenge them. Now, to do this, you are going to use the other interpretation. So you're going to be saying something like, in some ways, I could disagree with the views in interpretation 2, because actually not all of the policies the Nazis had for women were successful, and a lot of women stayed in work. You've got the overall disagreeing view. Then you can bring in examples from the other interpretation and your knowledge. You can say, for example, in interpretation 1, it highlights that actually lots of women stayed in work, could actually return to work when there was more need for women in industry. Then tie it into your knowledge, tie it into what you know about rearmament, etc. Again, use those quotes, use your knowledge, use the details that you know. So the key things here really are that you've got the ways you agree with the interpretation, you use the quotes and details from the interpretation linked to your knowledge. You've got ways you disagree with the interpretation, using quotes and your knowledge to explain why you might disagree. There's quotes, of course, from the other interpretation. And then once you've done all of that, then it's coming to that judgment. So a conclusion where you come to your overall decision. I mean, like, the very best answer will have that decision as you run through, but as long as it's there in the conclusion, the main thing is that you've got one there. Backing it up, saying why you think that, make sure you've used your argument you've developed so far to prove your point in your judgment, not just say, therefore I disagree or therefore I agree. You've got to make sure you've given a reason in there. So therefore I largely agree because, and then give your reason. But that's the key things. And the things I really want you to remember to include is using the interpretation in those paragraphs. It's very tempting just to use lots of knowledge, but you've got to make sure you use those, both of those interpretations, to either support the one that's mentioned in the question, or challenge it, and link that to your knowledge. Okay, don't forget spelling and punctuation and grammar as well in this one. There are 4 extra marks here, so things like capital letters for names and proper nouns, spelling those key words as well. Try your best on that too, because there's 4 extra marks available just for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. Okay, hopefully that's made it a little bit clearer, and good luck on that one. Thank you very much.